morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Janice and I are, as always, very pleased to be able to join you today. The topic I have in mind is remembering our Buddhist predecessors, those who have enabled us to encounter the Dharma. A group of them is depicted in this panoramic photo from 1925. As you know, the Buddhist Churches of America is our umbrella organization, but what exactly is it? What is the BCA? Well, principally it's you and me. The BCA consists of the members of the temples and the affiliated sanghas, along with a headquarters that owns some buildings in the Bay Area and employs a few staff people. At present, the number of active sanghas within the U.S. mainland is around 50 to 60. Let's today consider how the BCA came into existence. What path did our predecessors follow? Starting 120 years ago now, that's in 1899, Shin Buddhist groups began to be established in the U.S. and Canada under the Buddhist Mission to North America, or the Hokubei Bukkyodan. It was a propagation arm of the Nishi Honganji sect. Originally, the sanghas in the U.S. were composed only of people of Japanese ancestry, that is, first-generation immigrants and their children. Most of the ministers were born and educated in Japan, and the teachings were transmitted primarily in the Japanese language. To the extent that there was outreach by the ministers to European Americans, it was by teaching Theravada-style general Buddhism. The reason was that in those days, Shinran's teaching, or Jodo Shinshu, was perceived as being a Japanese ethnic religion, like Shintoism. The Second World War brought dramatic changes. Ties to Honganji in Japan were cut off temporarily, and the path forward would have to be set by the U.S. members. In 1944, the sanghas were reincorporated as a new organization, the BCA, with an elected governing board of Nisei, or second-generation Japanese Americans. At that time, most of the membership was imprisoned in camps such as Manzanar, Heart Mountain, and Tule Lake. Changing the name to the Buddhist Churches of America was a way of announcing that this was Buddhism of America, and not simply, no longer simply Buddhism coming to America. It was Buddhism of America, and the word churches was introduced with the same intent, to indicate that Shin Buddhism is an American religion. Nowadays, some of us might prefer not to call ourselves churches, but in the context of the incarceration, it's apparent why the name BCA was adopted. This is a photo of Manzanar Buddhist Church. Considering the predicament of those in camp, establishing the new organization was an amazing expression of optimism. The people who took this step anticipated that they would have a future outside of the barbed wire, that their rights under the Constitution would be recognized, and that eventually the government would view them as Americans entitled to due process. At that time, there was no assurance that these hopes would be fulfilled. Hope for the future was the outward-directed message conveyed by the name change. There was also an inward-directed message for Sangha members. To call the organization the Buddhist Churches of America was an assertion that Shin Buddhism would become part of the broader culture, extending to people of non-Japanese ancestry. It also marked a generational change for the Sanghas and a shift toward transmitting the teachings in English. Americanization of Shin Buddhism was already underway in the pre-war years, but it accelerated in the camps with the introduction of customs such as sermons at Sunday services and the use of Christian-originated terms such as minister and reverend to refer to Buddhist priests. There was also the printing of service books for English speakers, like this one, This actually dates to 1967, but I think most of the content is probably from the war years. The book I'm holding contains, as you can see in the table of contents, chanting texts as well as Buddhist invocations, creeds, scripture passages, benedictions, psalms, and epistles, all in biblical style English. Here's a sample. O thou the Buddha, the supremely awakened one, the most honored one, here are we gathered in thy presence with deepest reverence and adoration in our hearts. We place our whole trust in thee, in thy teaching and in thy order, and we do earnestly resolve to be good Buddhists and follow the holy path thou hast shown us, so that we may, like thyself, attain the happiest and most peaceful realm of nirvana. There was also the introduction of Christian-sounding hymns on Buddhist subjects accompanied by piano and organ. Here's an example. Lord, within thy holy doctrine, still thy presence we descry, source of wisdom, love, and power, every need to satisfy, and thy loving call obeying, self and sin we cast aside, on the eightfold path to follow, thee, our master and our guide. The world is continually changing. Despite our wishing that certain things would stay the same, it must have been difficult for first generation Issei Shin Buddhist followers to accept the evolution of their tradition here in the United States. The religion of their ancestors was being transformed into something Americanized and seemingly foreign. It was becoming less and less like what they grew up with. In Japan, as well, Shin Buddhism was undergoing a painful transformation at this time. Let's recall some key historical events. Sorry if I'm sharing some dates with you, but they're a little bit important. In 1603, the warlord Tokugawa Ieyasu established the shogunate, initiating the Edo period. You've probably heard of the Edo period, when Japan was closed to the outside world for 2.5 centuries. It was an era of social stability in which the political authorities and the religious authorities were closely connected. The dynamism of Shinran's teaching, that is Jodo Shinshu, the dynamism of his teaching was enough to cause concerns. Moreover, his writings contain harsh criticism of the emperor and of the Buddhist monks, which would not do at all. And so in the Edo period, the creative, spiritual content of Shinran's teaching was neglected. Institutional Buddhism became doctrinally frozen. Jodo Shinshu, so conceived, was for easing anxiety about the afterlife and had no value in this life. The historian Michihiro Amma describes it this way: by preaching to their followers to practice perseverance in hardship, even though such suffering was caused by the social structure itself, and to long for a better afterlife, Honganji leaders reinforced the existing social order. With this approach, Shin Buddhism did not run afoul of the government, but change was in store. 1868 is what's called the Meiji Revolution. The shogunate was brought to an end and started Japan's transition from a pre-modern society to a technological one. In the rush to modernize, Buddhism, the religion of Buddhism, was seen by some as archaic and foreign. It was a relic that should be abolished and replaced with Japan's original spirituality of Shintoism. Buddhist institutions were at this time subjected to persecution. As a matter of survival, the Honganji at first fought off the attacks. Several years later, though, when the threat had eased, Honganji leaders bowed to the authority of the Meiji emperor. This restored the tight connection with the government that had existed in the Edo period. So at that time, there were Buddhist teachers who believed that going back to the Edo framework was impossible. Instead, they attempted the difficult task of reforming Shin Buddhism from within. The man who pioneered this effort was Reverend Manshi Kyozawa. Although he died young, having been mostly unsuccessful in his reform effort, he inspired a group of successors who became influential in the 20th century. They brought a renewed focus on the Indian origin of Buddhism and on the individual experience of awakening to be felt here and now. I think their most significant contribution was the idea that Jodo Shinshu is a universal path to spiritual liberation. During the Edo period, with Japan shut off from the outside world, there was no reason to think of Shin Buddhism in that manner, and so the tradition took on the flavor of a folk religion. Reverend Kyozawa and his students sought to overturn that view. Now let's return to the founding of the BCA and the process by which Shin Buddhism was taking a new form as an American religion. I personally consider it extremely fortunate that this handful of reformers in Japan had rediscovered the universality of Shinran's teaching. If this rediscovery had not taken place, and if those ideas had not been nurtured at our temple, then my wife and I would never have encountered the Buddhist path. America's technological and multi-ethnic society, of course, is utterly different than Japan under the shogunate. The older type of Shin Buddhist path was well suited to the Edo period. However, for me, practice and realization on that path died out long ago, just as Shinran said in reference to the institutional Buddhism of his day. Shinran lived and wrote in 13th century Japan, yet in reflecting seriously on his words rather than on institutional forms, we will find that his teachings resonate powerfully in our present circumstances. As with Shakyamuni Buddha before him, Shinran's teachings are not limited to a specific historical period or locality. The psychological depth of his experience speaks to us directly here in 21st century America. This, I would say, is what enables Shin Buddhism to take its place as an American religion in accord with the aspiration of the BCA's founders. In remembering our predecessors, let's reflect on the BCA Sanghas that no longer exist. Although many temples and affiliated groups are doing well, others are in decline. Around 30 Sanghas that once gathered in Central and Southern California have become inactive or extinct. That is the case in the Imperial Valley, an agricultural area 100 miles east of here. It extends from the Salton Sea to the Mexican border. Prior to World War II, the cities of Brawley and El Centro were home to thriving Japantowns. The history of those pre-war communities is documented at the Imperial Valley Pioneers Museum over in El Centro. The museum includes a beautifully curated Japanese-American gallery managed by our friend Tim Asaman. Some of you may know Tim. One of the items on display in the gallery is a kansho, or Buddhist calling bell, which sadly has not been rung for service since 1942. The text embossed on it says Burore Bukkyokai, Brawley Buddhist Church. The bell was dedicated on the occasion of Hanamatsuri in 1933, when there were Sanghas in Brawley and El Centro. Most of the members spent the war years at the Poston and Gila camps in Arizona. Because of hostility toward Japanese Americans, very few former residents returned to the Imperial Valley when they were released from camp. The temples never reopened. The temple building in Brawley was demolished long ago, while the building in El Centro, shown here in this 1925 photo, is currently in use as a Sikh temple. The altar furnishings from El Centro Buddhist Church are in use today at the Buddhist Temple of San Diego, after the original San Diego furnishings were destroyed by an arson fire in 1943. Everything in the world is continually changing. Our predecessors made the Shin Buddhist path available to us, but our path is not identical to the one that they followed. I will conclude with a quotation that Shinran copied out on the final page of his Kyogyo Shinsho. My wish is that those who have found the path may lead those who come after them, and those who aspire for the path may follow their predecessors, thus following one after another, endlessly and uninterruptedly, until the boundless sea of birth and death is exhausted.